Give two drivers 10 laps around a circuit they've never driven before, same car, same conditions, and the same amount of time. Within a few laps, one of them already looks comfortable. They're finding pace, making small adjustments, and beginning to push towards the limit. The other driver is still searching. They're changing braking points, missing apexes, and experimenting with different lines. And every time they find some speed in one part of the circuit, they seem to lose it somewhere else. So what actually separates them? It's easy to look at the faster driver and assume they're simply more talented. Maybe they've got better reactions, better car control, or just naturally better at memorising a circuit. But that's not really what's happening. Experienced drivers aren't necessarily processing more information, they're identifying which information actually matters. Because first, you need to understand what an experienced driver is actually looking for. Welcome to Sabotage the Psychology of Racing, and think about what normally happens when you load into a circuit you don't know. You leave the pits, approach the first proper braking zone, and immediately start searching for a reference. Maybe there's a 100-meter board and you brake there. Too late. Next lap you try 120. Better. Then you start working on the corner itself. Maybe you can carry a little more speed into the apex, use slightly more curb, or get back onto the throttle earlier. Lap after lap, you'll gradually start constructing something that resembles a fast lap. But there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. But there is a problem. You're effectively learning the circuit one corner at a time. And a racetrack isn't really a collection of individual corners, it's a sequence of connected decisions. So what you do through one corner changes what becomes possible through the next. You might be able to carry a few more miles an hour into a corner, but if doing that puts the car in the wrong position for the next one, you've gained absolutely nothing. Likewise, compromising a corner might feel slower, maybe you brake slightly earlier, or maybe you sacrifice some minimum speed. But if doing that allows you to straighten the car earlier and get onto the throttle before one long straight, you could gain considerably more time than you sacrificed. And experienced drivers begin recognizing these relationships very quickly. They're not simply asking, how fast can I take this corner? They're asking, what does this corner affect? And that question completely changes the way you start looking at a circuit. You're no longer trying to perfect 20 individual corners. You're beginning to understand how those corners connect together. But then something happens. Something that can pull your attention away from this process almost immediately. The stopwatch. Your first proper lap time might be a 1:52, then you do a 1:49. 3 seconds immediately. Next lap, a 1:47. And suddenly, you're watching that number. You know there's more time available, so instead of simply trying to understand the circuit, you actively start searching for lap time. You brake a little later, or carry more entry speed, or even attack the curb harder. And sometimes, it works. The delta goes green. You found 3/10, and it feels like progress. Except, there's a problem. You might have absolutely no idea why you were faster. There's a massive difference between discovering a fast lap and actually understanding how you produce one. Because you can discover pace almost accidentally. Maybe you released the brake slightly differently and the car rotated better. Or maybe you positioned the car half a meter further towards the outside before turning in. The stopwatch tells you that whatever you just did worked. So naturally, the next lap, you try to do it again. Except now, you're trying to reproduce the result without necessarily understanding the process that created it. And this is where a lot of drivers waste laps, because the objective when you're learning a new circuit shouldn't initially be extracting every possible tenth. It should be reducing uncertainty. Think about your first laps out of the pits. Almost everything is unknown. Where can I brake? How much speed can I carry? And which curbs can I use? But perhaps most importantly, which corner actually matters to the lap? Every lap should answer some of those questions. And every time you answer one, the circuit becomes slightly more predictable. And that is important, because the more predictable the circuit becomes, the less conscious attention your brain needs to spend simply working out what's happening. You stop reacting to everything individually and you start recognizing things. That's where experience becomes incredibly powerful. After you've raced for long enough, you stop seeing every corner as something completely new. You might arrive at a circuit you've never driven before, but you've probably encountered similar problems somewhere else. A long corner that tightens towards the exit, or a heavy braking zone into a slow hairpin. The circuit itself might be unfamiliar, but the underlying problems aren't. So instead of starting completely from zero, your brain starts making predictions. I've seen something like this before. You approach the corner with an idea what the car will probably need. So you test it, and the car gives you feedback. Do that thousands and thousands of times, and eventually the process becomes so fast, from the outside, it starts looking like instinct. But it isn't magic, it's pattern recognition. You're taking previous experience and using it to predict what will probably happen next. And you might think that means more experienced you become, the easier every new circuit becomes. But there's also a problem with that, because sometimes experience can actually make you slower. Now imagine this, you're approaching a corner and immediately thinking you understand it. It looks similar to something you've driven hundreds and hundreds of times before, so naturally you treat it the same way. Same kind of braking technique and a similar line, except the corner has slightly different camber, or the grip changes halfway through, or even maybe there's a bump exactly where you're trying to rotate the car. Suddenly, the experience that normally helps you learn quickly is actually misleading you. And this is where really good drivers separate themselves. So the next time you load into a circuit you've never driven before, change the objective. Don't make the first goal, how quickly can I set a fast lap? You make it, how quickly can I understand this circuit? Start by identifying its structure. Where are the major braking zones? Which corners lead onto the longest straights? And which sections are connected? You're effectively trying to build a map of where the lap time actually comes from. Then you start creating reliable references. What you don't think is, I brake somewhere around here. Find something repeatable, a braking board, a curb, or a marshal post. Something you can identify every single lap, because once the reference becomes consistent, the feedback becomes useful. And then we get into something I think a lot of drivers get wrong. When something does go wrong, don't immediately change something. First ask why it went wrong. Now let's say you miss an apex. The obvious reaction is, I braked too late. So the next lap, you brake earlier. But what if braking late wasn't actually the problem? Maybe you released the brake too early and lost the rotation. Or maybe you carried in too much speed. Or maybe you even turned in too early. Those are completely different problems, and if you diagnose the wrong one, you can spend the next 10 laps practicing the wrong solution. That's why simply completing more laps doesn't necessarily mean you're learning more. You can drive 100 laps and reinforce exactly the same misunderstanding 100 times. What matters is the quality of information you're extracting from each lap. And if you start learning circuits this way, eventually something strange happens. The track starts to feel slower, but not your lap time, the actual experience of driving it. You're probably travelling considerably faster than you were 10 laps ago, but somehow everything feels less rushed. The braking zones seem longer, you're looking further ahead. You're already thinking about the next corner while you're in the current one. That feeling is incredibly important, and that brings us back to those two drivers from the beginning. Same circuit, same car, same 10 laps. Why can one seemingly understand the circuit within a handful of laps while the other is still searching? It's not necessarily because one driver can memorize the track faster, and it's not necessarily because they're naturally more talented. They're extracting different information from exactly the same laps. One driver is asking, how can I go faster? The other is asking, why was that faster? And those sound like almost the same question, but they're really not. Because one encourages you to keep changing things until the stopwatch gives you the answer you want. The other encourages you to actually understand what created the result. And over 10 laps, 20 laps, or even 100 laps, that difference becomes enormous. Don't judge your progress purely by how quickly the stopwatch starts dropping. Ask yourself, do I know why I'm using this braking point? Or do I understand why I'm taking this line? Or even know which corners actually determine my lap time? And once enough of that information starts connecting together, the circuit stops feeling like a sequence of corners you're trying to remember. It becomes something you can predict. You stop reacting to the track and you start anticipating it. And that is when you can really start finding the limit. But there's another part of this that goes even deeper. Because once you know a circuit well enough, You stop consciously thinking about every braking point, every turn in, and every correction. You just do it. And that's because your brain is actually making some of those racing decisions before you even realize it. So if you want to understand why that happens and how it affects the way you drive, make sure you click the video on screen now.